to see the start of a rally. True, this was to be a rally with a different, for the Daily Express London to Sydney Marathon was a modern throwback to an era and the great intercity races of the turn of the century. As such, it fired the imagination of John Citizen and his family, as well as the big names in international sport. The newly formed British Leyland Group opted for 1800s as their works entries, crewed by familiar faces from the former famous E.T. But number 27, the Gouldens Triumph, was one of several strictly family affairs, while all three of the fighting services were strongly represented. Here, for instance, is the Porsche entered by the Royal Green Jackets, undergoing the detailed inspection of the scrutineers. The Dutch national team's little belt-driven Duff in for the biggest belting of its career. Altogether, there were 18 Australian crews amongst the 98 cars which mounted the starting rank, a selected entry representing no less than 15 nationalities. As rally veteran Bill Bengry led the way in his Cortina GT, ahead lay 10,000 road miles, driving, and £10,000 for the winner. Never before had such a feat of logistics been undertaken in the motorsport, an investment totaling perhaps £1 million and 100,000 man-hours of preparation. And as Andrew Kahn let in the clutch of the route-centered Hillman Hunter, he knew that this was to be the daddy of them all. Turin, the third control, 25 hours from the start. The Australian crews, with Gelignite Jack Murray as their unofficial leader, declare their enjoyment of a leisurely tour across Europe. But some of the inexperienced newcomers realize for the first time just what they've let themselves in for. And it isn't only the crews who are working hard. With so much at stake, The small team of organizers, all distinguished competitors themselves, are leaving as little as possible to chance and leapfrog the route from control to control by aircraft. The service drivers reckon to be smart and properly dressed at all times. The service crews are more concerned with function than appearance, and the sheer distances of the marathon present problems new even to their legendary experience. Already 2 big names are in trouble. Peter Harper has had a water pump failure that will force his retirement, and Bengt Söderström has lost time and a lot of money in search of a 30-shilling spare part. The 6,500-mile journey to Bombay will get progressively more difficult with every mile to the east, and it's a non-stop, hard-going schedule until the first 6-hour rest period, still 4 days away, at Kabul in Afghanistan. But the Yugoslav output provides a high-speed, if hazardous, respite. In fact, the really fast boys were arriving in Belgrade anything up to 10 hours early to seek out a hot meal and a sound sleep away from the milling crowds of spectators. Others chose, or were obliged, to stick more closely to the official schedule and just keep soldiering on. With RAC Rally champion Colin Malkin and Brian Coyle sharing the work in the Hillman Hunter, Andrew Kahn reported all systems go for the big breakout into territory hitherto unknown even to the most adventurous international rally routes. The weather so far had proved more kind than anyone could have hoped, but a wet road in Istanbul is roughly the equivalent of ice in Piccadilly, and the approach to the ferry across the Bosphorus was no place to make a mistake. Now the highlights of the marathon began to shine. The fresh Irish charm of Rosemary Smith and the gay cavalier presence of Keith Schellenberg's vintage 1930 8-litre Bentley. Official cooperation in Turkey was almost too good for the organizers, who had not bargained for resurfaced roads to ease the competitors on their way. Even so, the sections from Istanbul to Ankara, including the notorious Bolu Pass and on to Tehran, were to penalize the entire entry and sort out the competitors from the tourists. In that battle ahead, reserves of stamina would tell, and the Bosphorus ferry was at least quiet, if not luxurious. Not least of the logistical problems was that of the press, but a chartered Viscount, fitted out as a flying press room, now began feeding out stories of the mounting drama of the marathon. Söderström out with a broken piston. Le Mans veterans Lumsden and Sargent crashed without injury. Woodley in hospital after an 80 miles an hour tire blowout. Nick Britton and his wife hit a horse at 100 miles an hour. And perhaps saddest of all, the Bentley, having made up time lost to repair a broken oil pipe, rolled into a gully when a treacherous road verge collapsed as the crew assisted another competitor. But now the terrain was as inhospitable as it was romantic. Ahead lay Afghanistan, the Khyber Pass, open only during daylight, and the gateway to India. For east is east, and west is west. And arranging their proverbial meeting is something of a hazardous business even today. It was a 42-hour dash from Kabul to Bombay, and now the principal hazard was not so much the terrain as the people. From the Pakistan frontier to Lahore, the roadside line of spectators was almost unbroken and grew thicker with every mile. Andy Khan and the Hunter were handily placed, and Jean Denton was still fresh despite a hard ride in her Nova-entered MGB. But Terry Hunter's Porsche, Baghetti's Lancia, and Dieter Klemzer's German-entered Ford, which had been fourth, had all succumbed to the hammering. The marathon's reception in New Delhi could only be described as fantastic. Innes Ireland, Mike Taylor and Andrew Hedges had stolen the headlines at Kabul by arriving on a flat tire. Now they did it again by being first car in, and were nearly mobbed as a result. Paddy Hopkirk was ahead of his teammate Altonen, but the third member of the British Leyland Works team, Tony Fall, had dropped right back. As Bombay and the end of the first 6,500-mile stage drew near, the feverish excitement of the spectators forced the crews to forget the fatigue of their 8-day ordeal by distance. Cowan, Coyle and Morkin brought the Hillman Hunter into Bombay lying sixth, having lost only 27 minutes on the appalling surface of the mountains of Asia Minor. They were 16 minutes behind the leaders, Roger Clark and Ove Anderson. But Andrew Khan was far too experienced a competitor to be misled into thinking that the marathon was all over bar the shouting. Paddy Hopkirk, too, was well satisfied with his fourth place, 22 minutes lost, 11 behind the leaders. The British Army Motoring Association made it, but none of the service entries were in the first 10. For once again, it was the big-name drivers that forged into the lead regardless of the conditions. Nevertheless, the survival at Bombay of more than 70 of the 98 who started speaks highly of both cars and crews, and set the organizers a pretty problem, since that was the limit of cargo accommodation for the sea crossing to Australia. Significant, too, was the cross-section of the entry to complete the first stage. Gone are the days when heavy estate car-type machinery was considered essential for such a journey. And the same observation could be applied to the crews. Mind you, there's always the exception that proves the rule. In all, 72 cars checked in at Bombay. Roger Clark's remarkable drive gave him a 9-minute lead on Simo Lampinen. Lucien Bianchi lay third with a work Citroën, Hopkirk fourth, Altonen fifth, Cowan sixth. Then the Australians, Firth and Jack seventh and eighth, Eric Jackson of Great Britain ninth, and another Australian pair, Hodgson and Rutherford, 10th. There was some feeling between the Australian and European crews, and it remained to be seen if the Aussies could make up lost ground over their own rugged territory. Meantime, the comfort of the liner Chusan could scarcely have offered the crews a more acceptable contrast to the dirt and labor of their epic drive. That cynical competitor John Sprinsel observed that the 10-day cruise proved more demanding than the journey so far, but all were agreed that the 4,000-mile, 76-hour dash across Australia would be the payoff. The two Hillman Hunters, for the RAF Motorsports Association entry had made it 2, together with the other 70 cars transshipped, fell immediately into the hands of the Australian police, a foretaste of the only official interference to mar the event in its final stages. But as far as the Australian public was concerned, their welcome in Fremantle and on the neutralized drive to Perth was as warm and friendly as had been seen the whole way. Indeed, the scene in Perth Stadium rivaled the Crystal Palace, as on December the 14th, the marathon cavalcade set off on the last long lap. Perth to you and me, 7 hours. To Marble Loch, 4. Then, deep in the outback, a fierce 1 hour 59 minutes to Lake King and a 14-hour grind over nightmare surfaces in blinding dust and 100-degree temperatures across the Nullarbor Plain, the halfway stage. At the Port Augusta control, Roger Clark arrived 14 minutes late, and a burnt-out piston was replaced by one from Eric Jackson's Cortina. This put the leader back to 3rd behind Lampinen and Bianchi. Then the Belgian passed the Finn, and Clark fought back to 2nd place. Meantime, Andrew Kahn passed both the British Leyland 1800s ahead of him into 4th place, Hopkirk dropping back to 7th. Gelignite Jack Murray went out at Branchina, and 2 of the Sydney Telegraph entries joined the mounting list of casualties. Only 500 miles to go, but the drama continued to mount. Roger Clark's furious drive proved too much for the differential. He commandeered one from a spectator, got going again, but had dropped back to 11th. Simo Lampinen, fighting for the lead, overturned in the section between Numarella and Nara, but Andy Kahn's superbly judged drive brought the Hillman Hunter up to 2nd place behind Bianchi. Zazada's Porsche had fought up to a magnificent 4th, but on the hot-foot chase to the finish, the leading Citroën hit a non-competitor. Bianchi was trapped in the wreck, but Ogier escaped injury. Andrew Kahn, Brian Coyle and Colin Malkin swept the Hillman Hunter into an unassailable lead. Paddy Hopkirk's fighting drive across Australia made him an equally secure 2nd. Roger Clark's reward was at least to be amongst the distinguished company of those who finished. Of the 98 that left the ramp at the Crystal Palace 10,070 miles away, 56 crews, including both the Hillman Hunters, experienced the unforgettable thrill of those triumphant final miles on the run into Sydney. The victory of Andrew Kahn, Brian Coyle, Colin Malkin and their Hillman Hunter was more than a magnificent sporting achievement. At a time when Britain is subjected to widespread criticism, the marathon itself and the worldwide response it engendered proved once again that the spirit of adventure lives on in these islands. That it should have been won by a car designed and built in Britain and driven by 3 typical members of the British motorsporting fraternity was ample justification for a little gentle waving of the flag. The words of the Autocars editorial summed up the achievement and significance of the day. Basically, a family saloon has packed into 12 days the average earners motoring for a year, but at probably 3 times the average speed, and over roads that ranged from flat-out motorways to suspension braking tracks that had not been used since the days of the pioneers' ox carts. It is no exaggeration to say that the applause of the great crowd at the Victory Parade in Sydney echoed round the world.